The camera opens on the endless golden expanse of the Egyptian desert. Heat shimmers over dunes that seem eternal, untouched by time. A single figure moves across the sand, dwarfed by the horizon, heading toward a colossal monument that pierces the skyline, the Great Pyramid. The narration begins softly, almost reverently, before dark undertones begin to surface. Ancient Egypt. The civilization that mastered the balance between chaos and order, between life and death, between the divine and the human. To most, Egypt represents glory, monuments carved into eternity, gods cloaked in gold, and a culture that seemed to exist beyond mortality. But beneath the perfection of its temples and the serenity of its rituals, there was something far more calculated. Egypt did not simply build an empire, it engineered a system. A system designed not to control bodies through fear, but to conquer something far deeper, the human will. The Egyptian world was one of beauty built on submission. Every stone of the pyramid, every word inscribed on the tomb, every offering left at a shrine served one higher purpose: obedience. The Nile's gentle rhythm shaped their days, but behind that peace lay an unspoken law. To defy order was to defy existence itself. The Egyptian state did not need chaos to enforce loyalty. It convinced people that order was sacred, and that surrender was salvation. In this civilization, power was not maintained merely by soldiers or whips, but by ideas so deeply ingrained that no rebellion could truly begin. The pharaoh's word was not a decree, it was divine truth. The concept of rebellion was not political, it was cosmic blasphemy. And in that belief lay the perfect system of control. A people who did not resist because they believed resistance was a crime against the very fabric of the universe. The camera now moves through the halls of a temple. The walls are alive with hieroglyphs, priests offering sacrifices, kings bowing before gods, farmers kneeling before idols. Every motion is choreographed, every gesture symbolic. What appears to be faith is, in truth, ritualized submission. The Egyptian priesthood mastered psychology long before the word existed. They understood that a human being's deepest fear is not death, it is disorder, exile from the cosmic balance. And so they taught obedience as the highest virtue, until submission itself became sacred. But there was a darker brilliance to it all. Egypt's rulers did not rely solely on terror, they relied on awe. The pharaoh was not a man demanding loyalty, but a god radiating inevitability. His image was everywhere, carved into cliffs, painted on tomb walls, inscribed in gold and stone, reminding his people that even the sand and stars belonged to him. You could not escape his gaze because it was built into the world around you. The Nile carried his reflection, the temples echoed his name, and every sunrise was said to be his rebirth. It was a vision so complete that rebellion became unthinkable. Behind that divine illusion, countless lives were consumed to uphold the promise of eternity. Farmers, artisans, slaves, all bound in a silent covenant that demanded sacrifice in exchange for belonging. The worker breaking stones under the desert sun was told he was serving the gods. The woman pouring grain at a shrine believed her devotion kept the heavens in balance. Each act of obedience was framed as cosmic necessity. This was the genius of Egypt's control, it turned servitude into purpose. As the camera lingers on the massive statues of gods, the narration grows quieter, almost intimate. There is something hypnotic about their faces, beautiful, emotionless, unyielding. The viewer begins to sense the psychological trap Egypt perfected. A world where control felt like harmony and submission felt like peace. It is tempting to look back and see this civilization as distant, buried under millennia of sand. But their system of obedience still whispers through time. In the way societies build order from fear, in the way power hides behind symbols of divinity and law, in the way people surrender their freedom for a promise of stability. The Egyptians did not just rule a people, they invented a blueprint for ruling the human spirit. And as the desert wind sweeps over the broken temples and eroded tombs, a haunting truth emerges. Egypt's greatest legacy was not the monuments that touched the sky, but the invisible architecture that reached into the soul, the art of breaking the human will without ever spilling a drop of blood. The story of Egyptian control begins not with the pharaoh or the whip, but with an idea, an invisible law that ruled both the heavens and the hearts of men. That idea was Ma'at. To the Egyptians, Ma'at was more than a goddess. She was the essence of existence itself, truth, balance, harmony, and cosmic justice. Every sunrise, every grain of sand moved under her law. To live outside of Ma'at was to live in chaos, a state they feared more than death itself. Ma'at was not merely worshipped. She was woven into the psychology of the nation. From the humblest farmer to the highest priest, Everyone's role in society was a reflection of her cosmic balance. If the Nile flooded too little or too much, it was not chance, it was a sign that someone had violated Ma'at. The concept turned faith into a system of surveillance. Everyone policed not only their neighbors but their own hearts. Every act, every thought was weighed on the invisible scales of divine order. Through this doctrine, Egypt created something extraordinary, a civilization that did not need rebellion to be crushed because rebellion could not exist. The fear of chaos was stronger than the fear of pain. The Egyptians believed that to question order was to invite the end of the world. That belief was the cornerstone of their empire's endurance. Temples taught Ma'at from childhood. Priests preached it in hymns that echoed through marble corridors. Artisans carved it into walls, scribes inked it onto papyri, and mothers whispered it to their children as they fell asleep. The story was always the same: order is life, disorder is death. The pharaoh's role was not to rule by his own will but to embody Ma'at itself. His word was balance, his judgment was divine truth. Disobeying him was not treason, it was sacrilege. The brilliance of Ma'at was its gentleness. It was not a god of wrath but of peace and rightness. Yet behind that serenity lay its most powerful form of control. People did not obey because they feared punishment, they obeyed because they feared being wrong, morally, cosmically, eternally. Ma'at replaced the need for tyranny with a far subtler prison: conscience. Imagine standing before the Temple of Karnak. Its vast pillars rise like a forest of stone, covered in hieroglyphs proclaiming the triumph of order over chaos. At the entrance stands a priest, his voice solemn as he chants, "Do not speak lies. Do not steal. Do not defy your king." Live in harmony, for Ma'at sees all. The worshipper bows not out of terror but out of profound moral submission. He believes his obedience keeps the universe intact. This is how Egypt sustained one of the longest continuous civilizations in history, by making loyalty synonymous with virtue. Even the gods were bound by Ma'at. Ra, the sun god, rose each morning only because he followed her law. When night fell, he battled the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos, to ensure that light returned to the world. Every dawn was proof that order had triumphed again. The message was clear: even the divine must obey. If the gods themselves were servants to Ma'at, what chance did a mortal have to resist? The state used this theology with precision. Law, ritual, and punishment were not tools of governance, they were extensions of cosmic order. Judges were called priests of Ma'at. When they passed sentences, it was said they restored balance to the world. Executions were not acts of cruelty but acts of purification. Through the illusion of holiness, control became righteousness. Psychologically, it was devastatingly effective. The Egyptians internalized Ma'at so deeply that even in isolation they would discipline themselves. In tomb inscriptions, nobles often wrote, "I have not transgressed Ma'at. I have not spoken falsehood. I have not taken more than my share." These confessions were not made under threat of punishment, but as self-declarations of purity. People longed to die in accordance with Ma'at so that their souls might be judged worthy in the afterlife. Thus, obedience extended beyond life itself. But the beauty of Ma'at concealed a darker cost. To preserve harmony, individuality had to be sacrificed. The human will, that restless spark that questions, resists, creates, was seen as a danger to cosmic order. Innovation was tolerated only when it reinforced tradition. Emotion was dangerous unless channeled into ritual. Egypt's golden calm was purchased at the price of human spontaneity. This was not merely religion, it was psychology weaponized. The idea of Ma'at functioned as a mirror. People looked into it and saw their worth only through compliance. It made disobedience feel like sin and submission feel like enlightenment. A man could be beaten, enslaved, or silenced, yet still believe he deserved it because in his heart Ma'at had already judged him. The paradox of Egypt was that it maintained peace through fear of disorder. That fear was so deep that even the enslaved believed their suffering upheld the divine plan. The farmer who toiled in unbearable heat believed that by enduring, he sustained Ma'at's balance. The artisan who carved tombs for kings believed that obedience would bring eternal peace. Every person was both prisoner and warden in a civilization where control wore the mask of righteousness. As the camera lingers over the symbol of the feather, Ma'at's emblem, drifting through temple air, the narrator's voice softens. The Egyptians called it the lightest thing in existence, the measure of every soul. But for all its beauty, that feather weighed heavier than chains. It kept millions bound not by force but by belief. The genius of ancient Egypt was not its monuments of stone, but its monument of thought, a moral architecture so perfect that it survived 3,000 years. And in its perfection lay its cruelty. For in a world where obedience was sacred and doubt was chaos, the greatest sin of all was to think freely. The illusion of divine order would have been incomplete without its living symbol, the pharaoh. In the shimmering light of the Nile Valley, he was not simply a ruler. He was a god walking among men. His breath was the wind that stirred the desert sands, his eyes the sun and moon that watched over all things. To speak against him was not rebellion but blasphemy. His throne was not carved by human hands, it was said to be shaped by the gods themselves. Yet behind that aura of eternity lay a carefully engineered system of control, one that transformed absolute power into divine inevitability. The pharaoh was the human embodiment of Ma'at, the sacred order that bound the universe. His existence justified every law, every punishment, every act of obedience. If Egypt's people feared chaos, the pharaoh was the guarantee that chaos would never come. He was father, god, and warden, roles fused so perfectly that loyalty to him became loyalty to life itself. The people did not merely serve him, they worshipped him, prayed for him, and feared his gaze even in death. The ancient text said, "His eyes are the eyes of Ra, his voice the voice of truth." In that belief, the pharaoh became something terrifyingly powerful, an omnipresent idea. Walk through the ruins of Luxor or Karnak and you can still feel it, that strange sense of being watched. His image stares from every wall, from colossal statues that dwarf the human form. His cartouche is repeated endlessly, carved into stone as if repetition could ensure immortality. The message was clear: wherever you go he is there. His likeness towered over marketplaces, temples, and tombs. To the Egyptian mind this was not propaganda. It was divine reality. The pharaoh was Egypt. Through rituals and architecture, his divinity was made visible. During festivals, he appeared in golden chariots surrounded by incense, musicians, and chanting priests. The crowds knelt, trembling not from fear but awe. His body shimmered with gold dust, a reflection of Ra's light, as he lifted offerings to the gods. The air filled with hymns proclaiming his eternal life. But this pageantry was not mere celebration, it was psychological theater. Every movement reinforced the illusion that the pharaoh existed on a plane beyond mortality. When he smiled, it was mercy. When he punished, it was justice. When he spoke, it was law. Even his private life was ritualized into holiness. Servants did not enter his chambers as attendants, they entered as worshippers. The food he ate was blessed. The water he drank was purified. Every gesture was part of a sacred script designed to blur the line between human and divine. Over time, that illusion became truth, not because it was real but because millions believed it was. Yet the pharaoh's power did not rest solely on faith. It rested on surveillance, a system as subtle as it was absolute. The Egyptian bureaucracy was a network of scribes, priests, and officials who reported on everything: harvests, prayers, behavior, speech. Temples doubled as administrative centers, their priests keeping meticulous records of the people's loyalty. The pharaoh's eyes were everywhere, etched into amulets and painted on tomb walls. The eye of Horus, the all-seeing emblem of protection and control. To live in Egypt was to live under that eternal gaze. Imagine being a farmer along the Nile. You work the land the pharaoh owns, pay the taxes he decrees, and worship the gods he commands. When drought strikes, you do not curse him. You beg forgiveness from the heavens, believing your own impurity has angered the divine order. The system was complete. It required no whips or soldiers, only belief and repetition. The pharaoh's power was sustained not by oppression, but by reverence that bordered on self-erasure. The few who challenged this divine authority were treated not as criminals but as cosmic diseases. Ancient inscriptions speak of rebels, erased from memory, their names chiseled out of monuments, their lineage condemned to vanish from eternity. To be forgotten in Egypt was the ultimate punishment, worse than death. For the Egyptians, immortality was achieved through remembrance. To lose one's name was to lose one's soul. Thus, erasure became a spiritual execution, an annihilation beyond physical torment. Even the transition of kingship was bound by ritual terror. When a pharaoh died, his body underwent mummification, not merely to preserve the flesh, but to prove that even death obeyed him. His heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, just as every Egyptian's would be, but the outcome was predetermined. The gods could not find a king unworthy of eternity. His tomb was built not only as a resting place but as a message: the ruler may die but the system lives on. Behind the splendor of crowns and scepters lay immense pressure. A pharaoh could not show weakness, could not doubt, could not fail. He was both prisoner and god, bound to the illusion that gave him power. His every decision had to align with Ma'at, or risk unraveling the world's balance. The irony was profound. To maintain control over others, he had to surrender his own humanity. The ultimate act of obedience in Egypt was to become the symbol of obedience itself. The camera lingers on the colossal statues of Ramses II, his face serene, lips curled in an eternal smirk of certainty. The narration lowers. He does not look down with cruelty but with confidence, the confidence of one who knows his people's devotion will outlive them all. His reign is over, yet his image endures, carved in stone while the hands that built it turn to dust. This is the immortality Egypt promised, not freedom but permanence. The pharaoh's divine kingship was more than a political system. It was the first grand experiment in total control, an empire where faith and fear became indistinguishable. His power did not need to shout. It whispered in prayers, shone through the morning sun, and echoed in the silence of the desert. The people did not obey because they were forced to. They obeyed because they could not imagine a world where he was not God. In that sense, the pharaoh was not a man who ruled Egypt, he was Egypt. A living monument to submission, a god forged from belief, and the perfect mirror of a civilization that had learned to love its own obedience. And as the desert wind moves across the ruins, carrying his name in whispers, one truth remains. The art of control reached its divine perfection the moment humanity forgot it was being ruled. Within the labyrinthine temples of ancient Egypt, behind walls carved with hymns to the gods and ceilings painted like the heavens, there existed a secretive and disciplined order, the priesthood. Cloaked in linen, their heads shaved in purity, these men and women were far more than mere servants of religion. They were the keepers of knowledge, the interpreters of the divine, and the architects of obedience. The pharaoh might have ruled by divine right, but it was the priests who defined what that divinity meant. They were the unseen hands shaping the minds of millions, perfecting the psychological machinery of control that would hold Egypt together for millennia. The temples themselves were microcosms of the cosmos, divided into sacred zones that mirrored the order of creation. To the common people, these spaces were forbidden, unreachable, but to the initiates they were both sanctuaries and prisons. Each new priest underwent years of training, learning the secret language of the gods: astronomy, mathematics, medicine, ritual, and magic. But beneath this education was a quieter, darker curriculum, one designed not to enlighten but to break. The path to divine service began with the destruction of the self. Historical and textual evidence hints at initiation rituals meant to test obedience and endurance. Candidates were isolated for weeks in lightless chambers deep within temple walls, fasting and reciting hymns until their minds blurred between dream and vision. Deprivation was called purification. Submission was called devotion. Those who broke under pressure were dismissed as unworthy. Those who endured were reshaped into instruments of control, stripped of ego, ready to serve Ma'at and the pharaoh without question. The priests learned that their minds were no longer their own, they were vessels for the divine order. Inside these dim sanctuaries, surrounded by the scent of burning resin and the echo of distant chants, the priests practiced rituals that blurred the line between faith and psychological conditioning. They anointed statues that breathed with life, whispered incantations to gods who spoke through them, and presided over processions that turned illusion into truth. The mastery of perception was their true art. They knew how to manipulate light, sound, and fear to inspire awe in the masses. When a statue's eyes seemed to glimmer or a flame flickered at a divine name, the people did not question, they believed. It was theater elevated to theology, and the priests were its directors. These rituals were not merely for the gods, they were for the state. Every offering to Ammonius, Osiris, or Ra reinforced the divine hierarchy that kept Egypt stable. The pharaoh was the living god, but the priests were his interpreters, the translators of his divinity. Through them, heaven and earth remained in balance. A single decree from the temple could sanctify a ruler or condemn him to oblivion. Power flowed through incense and prayer as surely as it did through armies and gold. But such control required discipline bordering on cruelty. Within the temple walls, priests lived by codes that governed every detail of existence. They were forbidden from certain foods, forbidden from intimacy, forbidden from casual speech. Sleep was rationed, emotions restrained. To speak without ritual was to profane the divine order. Over time, the priest's identity was eroded, replaced by sacred duty. The more they served, the less human they became, until they were little more than instruments of the system they upheld. In a civilization obsessed with eternal order, individuality was a disease. There were whispers, even among the ancient writers, of punishments and ordeals cloaked in holiness. Herodotus and later historians describe temple initiations that bordered on psychological torture. Novices confined in darkness, forced to confront visions of the afterlife, surrounded by the bones of the dead. Such trials were said to prepare them for communion with the gods, but the real lesson was obedience through fear. A mind broken by isolation becomes pliant, eager to believe anything that gives its suffering meaning. Egypt had discovered that faith could be forged in pain. The priests, once purified, became agents of that same process for others. They oversaw the ceremonies that kept the population docile: blessings for crops, processions for fertility, sacrifices for protection. Each ritual reinforced the message that life itself depended on submission to the divine hierarchy. Even funerary rites, the embalming, the recitations, the judgment scenes painted on tombs, were lessons in obedience. The living watched as the dead were tested before Osiris, their hearts weighed against the feather of Maat. To die unworthy was to vanish forever. The priests taught that lesson with exquisite precision, ensuring no one would ever dare to challenge divine authority. Beneath this veneer of holiness, the priesthood itself became a second empire within the empire. Temples controlled vast lands, managed granaries and commanded laborers. Wealth poured into their coffers through offerings and tithes. Over generations their power rivaled even that of the pharaoh. They justified it, of course, as service to the gods, but in truth they served themselves as much as the divine. The hierarchy that demanded obedience from the people was mirrored within the temple, where lesser priests obeyed higher ones with the same unquestioning devotion. The art of breaking the will had become institutional, perfected at every level. Imagine the moment before dawn inside a temple at Thebes. Torches flicker, casting long shadows on walls carved with prayers. A young acolyte kneels before an altar, trembling, eyes fixed on the floor. Around him elder priests chant in rhythmic tones, their voices low and resonant. The air grows thick with incense. The boy has not eaten for days. He is told that the god will speak through him if he is pure enough. Hours pass. The sound, the smell, the exhaustion blur his senses until he begins to see light where there is none, to hear voices in the silence. When he collapses in tears, the elders nod approvingly. He has been reborn, his will shattered, his faith unbreakable. This is how the priesthood maintained its hold over Egypt's mind and soul. They knew that to command obedience, one must first understand fear, not the fear of violence but the deeper fear of meaninglessness. By making service to the gods the only path to purpose, they ensured that even the suffering felt sacred. The Egyptians did not simply obey because they were forced to. They obeyed because obedience gave them identity. The temples, glowing with sacred fire in the night, appeared to the people as places of divine protection. Yet within those walls the manipulation of belief was constant, relentless, absolute. The priests preserved the illusion of harmony, even as they consumed individuality in its name. They were the keepers of Maat, yes, but also its enforcers, its executioners and its prisoners. In the silence after the chanting ends, the voice of the narrator fades to a whisper. The priests were the guardians of truth, but truth in Egypt was never meant to free. It was meant to bind. In their hands, wisdom became a weapon, faith a cage, and the human spirit a resource to be broken and reshaped in the image of the gods. Beneath the golden majesty of Egypt's monuments, beneath the shimmering stone faces of gods and kings, lay another reality, one that pulsed with sweat, hunger, and exhaustion. The temples and tombs that promised eternity were not built by divine hands, but by countless human ones. Farmers, prisoners, debtors, and captives dragged from conquered lands. They were the forgotten architects of glory, the silent multitude who sustained a civilization that worshipped perfection while feeding on human endurance. To understand how Egypt perfected the art of breaking the human will, one must step away from the palaces and into the dust, into the fields, quarries, and labor camps that made eternity possible. Every morning, before the sun rose above the desert horizon, the workers gathered near the river. Overseers shouted commands, their voices harsh against the soft murmuring of the Nile. The workers were bound not by chains but by duty, to their families, to their gods, and most of all, to Maat. To labor for the pharaoh was not presented as punishment, it was a privilege, a sacred service. The temples told them that each brick laid, each stone lifted, was part of the divine order. To disobey or to rest was to invite chaos, to anger the gods. Through this belief, Egypt turned suffering into worship. The scale of these projects was unimaginable. Massive quarries at Aswan echoed with the sound of chisels day and night. Teams of thousands hauled limestone blocks across blistering sands. Laborers dragged stones weighing tons using ropes made of papyrus fiber, their bare feet bleeding on the scorching ground. The Nile shimmered in the distance, a vision of relief that never came. Yet despite the unbearable conditions, the workers sang hymns as they toiled, songs that praised the pharaoh and thanked the gods for granting them purpose. This was not brainwashing by force, it was faith weaponized into obedience. Not all laborers were slaves in the conventional sense. Many were peasants repaying debts or fulfilling mandatory service during flood season, when their fields lay underwater. Others were captives from Nubia, Libya, or Canaan, bound to labor by conquest. But Egypt's genius was that it did not need to break their bodies to control them, it broke their sense of self. A man who believes his suffering holds cosmic meaning will endure anything. The state ensured that every drop of sweat was sanctified, every lash of the overseer's whip transformed into an act of divine correction. The overseers, often lower priests or military officers, maintained strict order. They kept detailed records of food rations, attendance, and productivity. Hieroglyphic graffiti from workers' settlements like Deir el-Medina reveal that those who complained were disciplined not just physically but spiritually. They were accused of betraying Ma'at, of endangering balance. To question labor conditions was to question the gods' plan. Punishments varied from public humiliation to forced silence, and in extreme cases, erasure of one's name from temple records, a spiritual death worse than execution. The system made rebellion unthinkable. But not everyone accepted their fate. There are traces, faint yet defiant, of resistance. In the 12th century BCE, the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings laid down their tools and refused to work, history's first recorded labor strike. Their protest was not revolutionary, they did not demand freedom. They begged for food rations owed to them. Even in defiance, they spoke the language of obedience. The state responded with measured discipline, restoring order without admitting fault. The message was clear: you may complain but never question. Egypt allowed tiny fractures to vent pressure, ensuring the structure of control never truly cracked. The workers' villages were microcosms of the larger order, small, walled communities where every task was regulated. Priests blessed their food, scribes monitored their output, and guards ensured they stayed within bounds. Even rest was structured. Leisure came in the form of religious festivals, processions that temporarily reversed roles. Slaves danced, peasants drank, laughter filled the air. But even these moments of release served the system. They reminded people that joy itself came only through obedience, through serving the gods and the pharaoh. Freedom was permitted only when it was safe. To the modern eye, these people seem enslaved. But to themselves, they were participants in a cosmic cycle. Their work built temples where gods lived, tombs where kings became eternal. Their suffering had meaning, their deaths purpose. A laborer who collapsed beneath a stone might be mourned as one who served the light. In this way, Egypt achieved something far more enduring than domination through fear. It convinced its people that obedience was holiness. The will was not broken violently, it was willingly surrendered. Consider the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Tens of thousands of workers lived in temporary cities, organized with military precision. They received food, medical care, and beer, all distributed according to rank and performance. Hierarchies extended even here. Scribes recorded every loaf of bread, every missing tool. At the top, priests oversaw ceremonies to bless the stones before placement. Each block was consecrated as a piece of divine architecture. When workers dragged those stones up the ramps, they were not building for the pharaoh, they were building for eternity. To doubt was to desecrate. And yet, beneath the hymns and blessings, the cost was unimaginable. Lives were spent like offerings, years consumed by a system that demanded perfection and left no room for humanity. The sun-baked corpses buried near pyramid sites were not honored with names or tombs. They vanished, anonymous, into the sands of history. Their labor ensured that kings would be remembered forever, while their own existence dissolved into silence. That was the final cruelty, to give everything for eternity and receive only oblivion in return. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: many of them were content. The human will can survive pain, but it cannot survive purposelessness. The priests and rulers of Egypt understood this better than any tyrant before or since. They offered their people meaning instead of freedom, belonging instead of rebellion. And in that trade, they created a civilization that lasted longer than any other on earth. As the camera glides over the ruins of Giza, the voice grows softer, reverent, and mournful. The pyramid casts a shadow across the desert, a perfect shape, eternal and unyielding. It is both monument and tomb, built by countless hands that believed they were serving the gods. In truth, they were serving a system that had already conquered their souls. The perfection of those stones is not the triumph of architecture. It is the triumph of control. The pharaohs knew that true power does not need chains. It only needs belief. And belief was Egypt's masterpiece. The beauty of Egypt was built on silence, a silence kept by pain enforced not only through belief, but through punishment sanctified as divine justice. The temples proclaimed harmony, the hymns praised balance, yet behind the serene mask of Maat lay a darker engine, the machinery of discipline. When the sacred order was disturbed, the Egyptians did not see punishment as cruelty. It was purification. It was the restoration of cosmic truth through suffering. For them, torment was not chaos, it was order reborn through pain. In this world, every lash of the whip, every execution, every ritual mutilation carried the weight of divine necessity. The state did not punish in rage, it punished in ceremony. To witness a public sentence in ancient Egypt was to see religion and law fused into a single performance. There were no mobs, no shouts of hatred. Instead there was ritual. The condemned knelt before the symbols of Maat, the feather of truth, the staff of justice, and heard the charges read aloud by priests whose calm voices made the words sound sacred. The punishment that followed was presented not as vengeance, but as healing, the rebalancing of a world that the sinner had thrown into disarray. Some offenses were small: theft, blasphemy, defiance. Others were greater: conspiracies against the pharaoh, acts of sacrilege, corruption among temple officials. Each was punished according to its perceived disruption of harmony. Thieves might have their hands amputated, not to deter others, but to remove the impurity from the body. Liars could have their tongues cut out, silenced for eternity. Inscriptions speak of rebels burned alive or drowned in the Nile, their deaths offered to the gods as sacrifices of purification. The punishment fit not the crime but the metaphysical wound it caused. To the Egyptians, pain was never random. It was symbolic. The body was a map of divine truth. To harm one part was to make a statement about the soul. A man whipped across the back was being cleansed of falsehood. A woman shaved and paraded was being stripped of deceit. In every blow there was meaning, in every scream a lesson. The priests recorded these punishments meticulously, ensuring that suffering was codified, not chaotic. Theirs was a cruelty that wore the face of order. The prisons of Egypt were not designed for reform, nor for mercy. They were spaces of erasure, dark cells where a person was slowly unmade. Prisoners were kept in silence, isolated from speech and light. The absence of sound itself became punishment, driving the mind inward until it collapsed upon itself. The body might survive, but the spirit disintegrated. For Egypt, that was the true victory, to make a man destroy himself in the name of the gods. The Nile itself was often used as instrument of judgment. Those accused of grave crimes could be thrown into the river, their fate left to the gods. If they drowned, it was a sign of guilt. If they survived, Maat had deemed them innocent. The symbolism was devastating. The same river that gave life could also reclaim it. In this duality, Egypt found both mercy and terror. To live under such a system was to understand that even nature itself enforced divine justice. Execution, when deemed necessary, was always sacred. The condemned were sometimes forced to recite confessions before their death. I have betrayed the truth. I have turned from Maat. The words transformed their destruction into ritual cleansing. Death was not meant to punish, it was meant to restore balance. A man who accepted his fate with humility could still be reborn in the afterlife, purified through pain. In this way, cruelty became redemption, a logic so complete that even the victims sometimes accepted it. Yet not all punishment was physical. Egypt understood that the deepest control lay in the mind. There were subtler forms of breaking: exile, humiliation, silence. To be cast out from one's community was to lose one's connection to Maat, to be stripped not only of rights but of identity. The condemned wandered the deserts beyond the Nile's fertile valley, nameless, forsaken, spiritually dead. If the samurai's physical training was a trial of endurance and their psychological training a descent into control, then their spiritual education was the abyss itself, a place where pain became divine. This stage was not about killing others or even resisting death, it was about transcending humanity altogether. The masters believed that the perfect warrior must learn to dissolve the boundary between life and death, between self and nothingness. And to achieve that, he had to embrace suffering as sacred. Every wound, every scar, every moment of agony was a conversation with the gods. It was through pain that the samurai believed they could approach enlightenment, not through peace but through purification by torment. This belief was not born in isolation. It was rooted deeply in Japan's fusion of Shinto and Zen Buddhist philosophies. Shinto taught that spirits inhabited all things, the mountains, the rivers, the sword itself, and that harmony with these forces required purity of spirit. Zen, meanwhile, taught that enlightenment lay in emptiness, in detachment from worldly illusion. Together, they formed a paradox that shaped the samurai soul. To achieve peace, one must first destroy the self. The warrior was told that pain was the gateway to that destruction, a sacred test through which the illusions of comfort, identity, and fear were stripped away. The body became both temple and battlefield, and the only prayer was endurance. In this spiritual framework, suffering was not to be avoided, it was to be invited. Samurai were known to perform misogi, purification rituals that involved exposing themselves to freezing waterfalls in winter, fasting for days, or meditating motionless for hours in snow and silence. They called it polishing the mirror of the soul, scraping away weakness through hardship. Masters would say, if your body trembles, let it is your spirit that must remain still. The purpose was to learn how to separate the mind from the body, to watch pain as if it belonged to someone else. Through repetition, the warrior achieved a terrifying serenity. His body could be suffering, but his spirit would remain untouched. These rituals bordered on torture, yet they were performed with the calm precision of prayer. Warriors would kneel beneath waterfalls until their limbs went numb, chanting sutras as icy water pounded against their skulls. Others would meditate while holding painful positions for hours, their legs cramping, their spines shaking, but their faces unmoving. To interrupt meditation was disgrace. To faint was failure. Some would even slice their own skin lightly before meditation, using the sting as a reminder of impermanence, the truth that all things, including pain, would pass. The act was not self-harm in the modern sense, it was self-erasure. Each drop of blood symbolized another layer of the ego being washed away. The goal was to achieve mushin no shin, the mind without mind. In this state, the samurai moved and fought without thought, reacting purely from instinct and training, free from emotion or hesitation. To reach this condition required total psychological surrender. Pain, humiliation, exhaustion, all became tools to dismantle the illusion of the self. The samurai who mastered this no longer perceived battle as chaos. It became meditation in motion. The clash of swords, the screams of dying men, the spray of blood, all dissolved into stillness. The warrior became the weapon, and the weapon became the will of heaven. But there was a darker consequence to this enlightenment. In stripping away fear and ego, the samurai also stripped away compassion, doubt, and remorse. They transcended humanity, but in doing so, lost what made them human. A Zen monk once described the perfect warrior as a man who kills without anger and dies without grief. It was meant as praise, the image of one who had achieved ultimate peace. Yet hidden within that peace was something deeply unsettling, the transformation of pain into devotion, cruelty into grace. The samurai who had found serenity in slaughter was not enlightened, he was emptied. In Egypt, pain was not simply endured, it was worshipped. To understand why the civilization endured for millennia, one must look beyond politics and monuments, into the very theology that bound it together. The Egyptians believed that the gods themselves had suffered, that agony was part of the divine order. Every wound, every hardship, every torment mirrored the struggles of their deities. This belief transformed pain from punishment into a sacred bridge between the mortal and the divine. When a man bled, he was not just a victim, he was reenacting the story of the gods. The foundation of this belief lay in myth. The gods of Egypt were not flawless beings of light, they were complex, emotional, and vulnerable. They wept, fought, bled, and even died. Their conflicts mirrored human ones: jealousy, betrayal, love, revenge. The most haunting of these stories was that of Osiris, the god who was murdered, dismembered, and reborn. His death was not tragedy, it was necessity. It taught the Egyptians that destruction was part of renewal, that suffering gave birth to eternity. To break the body was not to end life, but to begin transformation. Osiris's myth became the backbone of Egyptian spirituality. He was slain by his brother Set, the embodiment of chaos, and his body was cut into pieces and scattered across the Nile. Isis, the devoted wife and goddess of magic, searched tirelessly, reassembling his broken body and breathing life back into him. In this resurrection, Egyptians saw the ultimate truth: the divine order could only be maintained through pain. Every year, festivals reenacted this myth, with priests and commoners alike mourning, fasting, and lamenting, reliving the gods' suffering to ensure the land's fertility and balance. The rituals were graphic and emotional. In some temples, statues of Osiris were symbolically buried in earth mixed with seeds, then unearthed weeks later when the sprouts began to grow, a living metaphor for rebirth through decay. The people wept for Osiris as if for a loved one. Through grief they felt purity. Through mourning they found peace. Pain became the price of life's continuation. The gods suffered, so humanity must too. And Osiris was not alone. Horus, his son, embodied the endless war between justice and chaos. His battles with Set were depicted in vivid temple reliefs, eyes gouged, limbs torn, blood spilled. These wounds were sacred symbols. The eye of Horus, born from his suffering, became a talisman of healing and protection. It represented the paradox at the heart of Egyptian belief: only through pain could restoration occur. Even the gods' injuries were transformed into sources of power. Suffering was not failure, it was transcendence. The priests drew heavily from this theology to shape human conduct. Every act of discipline, every ritual of punishment, echoed divine precedent. If the gods themselves had bled, who were mortals to resist pain? When a worker was whipped for disobedience, it was said that he was being purified like Osiris in his death. When a soldier endured wounds in battle, his scars were marks of divine favor, proof that he had partaken in the cosmic struggle between Ma'at and chaos. The entire social order thus rested on this theology of suffering. To hurt was to be sanctified. The temple carvings reflect this obsession with pain as rebirth. Reliefs show pharaohs offering sacrifices, sometimes animals, sometimes human captives, as symbols of divine struggle. The pharaoh was more than king. He was the living Horus, the embodiment of the god's endurance. His duty was to suffer on behalf of his people, to bear the burden of maintaining Ma'at. When pharaohs fasted, bled during rituals, or risked their lives in sacred hunts, they imitated the gods who had once suffered to protect creation. The idea that power was born through pain justified the divine monarchy itself. Even the afterlife mirrored this structure. The journey through Duat, the Egyptian underworld, was not peaceful. The soul faced trials, torments, and monstrous guardians. To reach paradise, the field of reeds, one had to survive ordeals of fire, water, and judgment. The dead were weighed against the feather of Ma'at, their hearts exposed, their sins stripped bare. It was not punishment, it was purification. The gods demanded that every soul, no matter how noble, must suffer before attaining eternal peace. Thus, even in death, pain was the price of truth. Rituals in daily life reinforced this cosmic rhythm. The priests practiced acts of self-denial, fasting for days, sleeping on reed mats, enduring the burning desert sun. They believed these hardships connected them to the divine plane. Farmers too saw their toil as a reflection of Osiris's agony, cutting into the earth like cutting into flesh, burying seeds as if burying the god himself, awaiting his resurrection in the harvest. Even the annual flooding of the Nile, which destroyed and renewed the land, was seen as Osiris's blood flowing through Egypt, a sacred cycle of death and rebirth. This intertwining of faith and pain gave Egypt remarkable endurance. The people accepted hardship as part of existence, not as oppression. They did not rebel against suffering because suffering gave them meaning. The priests and pharaohs understood this deeply. Control was not maintained by fear of death, but by reverence for pain. A civilization that believes agony is divine does not need chains. Its people enslave themselves willingly, convinced that their endurance serves eternity. There were moments when this belief was pushed to extremes. During times of famine or plague, priests led mass rituals of lamentation, encouraging citizens to wail, beat their chests, and cover themselves in ash. These acts were not despair but devotion, collective suffering to restore balance. Even in grief, the Egyptians sought harmony. They did not see the gods as cruel for demanding pain. They saw themselves as privileged to share in divine struggle. The mythology of the gods became psychology for the people. Every fear, every heartbreak, every physical wound could be given sacred meaning. A grieving mother could see herself as Isis. A dying man could see himself as Osiris. The gods' suffering was humanity's mirror, a way to explain why pain existed at all. In that explanation lay Egypt's most dangerous genius. It made pain beautiful. And so, over thousands of years, Egypt built not just monuments of stone, but monuments of belief. Pyramids and temples were merely the physical echoes of a spiritual architecture, one that placed suffering at the center of creation. The priests taught that even the sun god Ra traveled through darkness each night, fighting serpents of chaos before rising again. Dawn itself was proof that pain could be conquered only through endurance. Every sunrise was divine suffering renewed. In the flickering torchlight of temple walls, One can still read these truths carved in stone: gods with wounds that glow like stars, kings standing tall though scarred, prayers that praise agony as enlightenment. The Egyptians did not see this as contradiction. For them, beauty and pain were the same force, the price and proof of existence. As the narrator's voice deepens, the camera glides across colossal statues of gods half buried in sand, serene, immortal, and unfeeling. These were not idols of comfort, they were reminders. To be divine was to endure. To live was to suffer in harmony with the cosmos. In the end, Egypt's lesson was eternal. Pain is not the enemy of order, but its foundation. The gods suffered to create the world, and humanity must suffer to preserve it. From the bleeding Osiris to the burning fields, from the punished laborer to the disciplined priest, every cry, every wound, every sacrifice was an offering to the same truth, that only through suffering could Ma'at, the balance of all things, survive. And in that belief, Egypt achieved immortality. There comes a point in every civilization where cruelty stops being a tool and becomes a virtue. In Egypt, that point was reached long before the rest of the world even understood what control truly meant. By the time of the New Kingdom, when the pharaohs ruled with divine authority and the temples had become cities of gods and power, mercy itself was seen as a weakness. The Egyptians had refined their understanding of suffering so deeply that they no longer distinguished between justice and pain. To be merciful was to disrupt Ma'at, the sacred balance. And to disrupt Ma'at was to commit the greatest sin of all. The land that once thrived on harmony now thrived on obedience. Every breath of the people, every grain harvested, every act performed was measured against divine order. The pharaoh did not simply govern, he embodied the law. He was the living Ma'at, the center of the moral universe. If he decreed suffering, it was not cruelty, it was balance restored. This transformation of power into sacred violence marked the true perfection of Egypt's system. Cruelty was no longer feared, it was worshipped. The pharaohs themselves lived this paradox. Behind the gilded crowns and jeweled masks were men haunted by divine responsibility. Their rule demanded absolute control, and absolute control demanded ritualized cruelty. Amenhotep II boasted in his inscriptions of personally executing prisoners, impaling hundreds in the sight of the gods as offerings to Ra. To him, these acts were not barbaric, they were sacred affirmations of divine order. Ramses III had his own officials mutilated and burned alive when accused of conspiracy, ensuring their spirits would never rise again. The violence was not random. Each execution was a performance of cosmic justice. Even the language of cruelty evolved into poetry. In temple carvings, conquered enemies were depicted kneeling, their arms bound, throats exposed to the pharaoh's blade. Yet the accompanying hieroglyphs did not speak of vengeance, they spoke of purification. The enemies of Ra are unmade, one inscription reads. Their blood feeds the soil of truth. The pharaoh's dagger became an instrument of rebirth. Violence was transfigured into ritual. Every drop of blood spilled under the Egyptian sun was believed to water the roots of order. The priests reinforced this ideology with unwavering precision. Mercy, they taught, was the seed of chaos. To forgive was to allow imbalance to grow. When the Nile flooded too high or failed to rise, it was blamed not only on nature but on impurity. Someone had failed to punish enough, to purge enough, to enforce the sacred law. Sacrifices followed. The people learned that stability demanded pain. The more cruel the correction, the more righteous it seemed. Egypt's peace, its golden calm, was built upon this silent logic. The suffering of a few ensured the harmony of all. But the genius of Egypt's cruelty was that it wore a mask of serenity. Unlike later empires that glorified conquest and slaughter, Egypt's violence was ceremonial, quiet, wrapped in the beauty of ritual. A priest could chant a hymn while overseeing an execution, a scribe could record it as the restoration of light. The act of killing became indistinguishable from the act of worship. The sacred and the sadistic were one. Inside the temples, the high priests conducted purifications not only for the living but for the dead. Those deemed impure were denied mummification, condemned to decay and be forgotten, the ultimate horror in a society obsessed with eternity. The denial of burial was not a punishment of the body but of the soul. It erased the possibility of afterlife, cutting a person out of cosmic memory. It was an execution beyond death itself, cruelty elevated to metaphysical annihilation. Egypt had found a way to destroy even the spirit, not through rage but through sanctity. This moral inversion, where cruelty became order and mercy became chaos, is what made Egypt's control unbreakable. People did not fear pain, they feared disorder. They did not seek freedom, They sought approval from the divine hierarchy. When a man was beaten, he did not curse the gods, he thanked them for correction. When a woman was punished, she prayed for forgiveness, not justice. This was not a society ruled by the sword, but by belief so profound it shaped every instinct. The perfect slave was not one who was chained, but one who believed the chain was holy. The greatest expression of this theology of cruelty was found in Egypt's ceremonies of the dead. The opening of the mouth ritual, designed to awaken the senses of the deceased, often involved symbolic violence, cutting, piercing, and burning, to release the soul from its mortal impurity. Even in death, pain remained the key to transcendence. The priests believed that only through this divine wounding could the spirit become eternal. Thus, even the promise of paradise required the echo of suffering. As the centuries passed, Egypt's obsession with divine order deepened, even as its empire weakened. Foreign invaders came, Libyans, Nubians, Persians, but they too adopted Egypt's sacred cruelty, understanding its efficiency. The system was too elegant to destroy. It was not built on fear or force but on faith. Faith that every act of pain had purpose. Faith that the gods demanded submission. Faith that mercy was treason. By the time of the late period, cruelty had become invisible, normalized, eternal. Workers still toiled for monuments, priests still chanted blessings over punishment, and pharaohs still proclaimed the righteousness of their wrath. Egypt no longer needed to prove its authority, its cruelty had become sacred law. In a sense, it was no longer even cruelty, it was simply the natural rhythm of the cosmos. To stand in the shadow of Egypt's ruins today is to feel that same silence. A silence that once echoed with the cries of devotion and the chants of purification. The stones seem peaceful, but beneath that peace lies a memory of control so perfect it outlived the kings who wielded it. The temples, the pyramids, the tombs, they were not just monuments to the dead, they were monuments to obedience. Each one was built upon the idea that human will must be shaped, crushed, and refined until it became something divine. And yet, the paradox remains, Egypt's cruelty was not born of hatred. It was born of devotion. They believed they were preserving the balance of the universe, maintaining the fragile thread between chaos and order. Their gods demanded perfection, and perfection required sacrifice. To be merciful was to risk cosmic collapse. In this sacred logic, compassion itself became heresy. It is here that Egypt's true darkness lies, not in the brutality of its punishments, nor the weight of its slavery, but in its moral clarity. The Egyptians did not see themselves as cruel. They saw themselves as righteous. That is the most terrifying form of cruelty, the kind that believes it serves the light. When a culture convinces itself that pain is purity, it ceases to recognize evil. It no longer tortures out of malice but out of love for the gods. As the final rays of sunlight fade across the desert, the narrator's voice turns quiet, solemn. The great civilization that worshipped beauty and balance also mastered domination through devotion. Its cruelty was not chaos. It was control disguised as harmony. Egypt's perfection was not its monuments or its art, it was its understanding of the human soul. It learned that people will endure anything if they believe their suffering serves something greater. In that revelation, Egypt transcended its own time. Every empire that came after, Rome, Babylon, even modern nations, would echo this truth in new forms. The lesson was immortal. True power does not break the body. It sanctifies its breaking. And as the wind whispers through the broken pillars of Luxor and Karnak, one can still feel the echo of that perfection, the perfection of cruelty made divine. The desert keeps its silence now. The temples are empty, the gods long gone, yet Egypt's presence lingers in every shadow of civilization. What they built was more than stone, it was a system of belief that turned obedience into immortality. Their monuments were not only tombs for kings but blueprints for control. A way to make people surrender willingly in the name of divine order. Even after millennia, the lesson remains unchanged. Beauty can disguise cruelty, and faith can be the most perfect form of submission. Egypt showed the world that to rule souls, one must first teach them to believe that suffering has purpose. That idea has outlived every dynasty, every empire, every god. As the wind sweeps across the sand, the whisper is almost human: endure, obey, believe. And in that whisper lies the oldest truth of all, that the will of man can be broken not by force but by faith.